I'll just say, just singing with you, it's good to be back. There's no place like Stantonville. Also, shame on you if you laughed at the picture of me on the screen last week. That's all. That's all I have to say. I thought about doing some imitation of the Heartbreak Kid, but decided that wouldn't be probably good. Anyway, so I'll just stick with the shame on you. If you're worried whether or not, if I've seen the picture, only 100 times by this point in time has it been shown to me. You know that I'm a proud child of the Appalachian Mountains, of course, West Virginia, but the Appalachian Mountains, of course, run from Tennessee, really Mississippi, all the way up into Maine, and so I'm proud to be from the Appalachian Mountains. I know there are others of you here that have roots in the Appalachian Mountains, and we love the mountains. Even those of you who are not from the mountains love to visit the mountains, and we love the mountains and love to be proud to be from the mountains. Students are from over in that neck of the woods. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's beautiful. The people are wonderful, hardworking, salt of the earth type people. There's just a lot of reasons to be proud to be from Appalachia. But anytime there's something beautiful like that, there's also a dark side, isn't there? Poverty has always been a problem in the beautiful mountains. And I suppose more recently, over the last 30 or 40 years, the drug epidemic has only increased the difficulty of poverty, or poverty increased or contributed to that. There's a lot of things going on, but you know, as you look at the mountains and you look at the statistics, there's a serious problem with opioids and addiction and even overdose. In fact, it's estimated that the number of overdose deaths in the Appalachian Mountains is 72% higher than it is in the rest of the country. There's a dark side to the mountains, and you can see on a map where things are a little darker. That's where overdose deaths are increased, and we could zoom in even further and you can see where it's even more of a problem, and a lot of that would be in my own state, but even dipping down into East Tennessee. There's a beautiful side of the mountains, right? But there's also a dark side, and there's lots of reasons for that. But the contrast is serious and it's stark. A lot of people here love to go to the beach. And we love the beach because of the beauty of it and the ocean and the sound. Oh, there's lots of reasons to love the water and the ocean and the beach. But if you've ever dug very deep at all, you know there's a dark side, right? There's, of course, because you're on the coast, you've got some issues with smuggling and drugs and crime and mistreatment of service workers. There's all this stuff going on. There's two sides, right? There's the beautiful side that we like to see, but any place where there is money to be made, you can know that there's some stuff going on that's probably below board and not all that great. There's a good side, but there's also a dark side. On a far lighter note, we all know the difference between the good side, the light side, and the dark side, right? When it comes to Star Wars. And we know the difference, and we know the contrast that exists between the two. In Hebrews chapter 12, if you'll turn your Bibles over there this morning, I think we see a very clear and stark contrast between two mountains that the writer of Hebrews is trying to help us see. And as you look at this text, I want to remind you what we've been talking about all year long, that there's this group of people who are tempted to go back to Judaism, though they've become followers of Jesus. And throughout the letter or sermon of Hebrews, the writer's been trying to say, don't go back to Judaism, don't go back. And you're sick of hearing me say that, but today it's like he's really trying to drive the point home in a way that he hasn't up to this point. Like, this is where he says, okay, it's like I'm getting really serious. If you haven't seen the contrast between the way of Jesus and the old way of Judaism, you will see it in this passage. And I think the temptation really for us all along is to say, okay, that's great. So he's going to contrast, you'll see in this passage, Mount Sinai versus Mount Zion, and we're left asking, that's fine, what's this have to do with us? And here's why I think this is still important, vitally important for us. We may not be tempted to go back to Mount Sinai and the ways of Judaism, but we are tempted by Satan to sometimes think that the shiny things of this world are maybe just a little better, maybe not better than Jesus, but better than they are. And maybe we're tempted sometimes to see our own sin as better, or maybe not as bad as it actually is, and elevate it a little bit. And maybe sometimes we're tempted to think that our own good works are somehow better than they actually are. And in that way, then, we need to see the contrast between the way of Jesus, Mount Zion, and the ways of this world and the ways that Satan might draw us in to his ways. Now, before we dive into this passage in Hebrews chapter 12, I think you need to see what's going on in Mount Sinai, all right? If you're like me, I'm not as familiar with some of these Old Testament stories and passages as I should be. It's just kind of an interest thing. And I don't think I've ever really paid attention to just how scary a place Mount Sinai was. Remember that God's people have escaped from Egypt, and they've been wandering, or they've been led through difficult places, and they've come to Mount Sinai where God's going to give his law. And we think, yeah, the law, the Ten Commandments, and sure, there was the golden calf, and there were some good stories, but have you ever really paid attention to how dark this place was? Let me show you a couple of passages. I'll put them on the screen. Just some images of how dark and difficult this place was. So they arrived there, Exodus 19, and here's what God said to his people. You shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, whether beast or man, he shall not live. Pretty serious, right? Like, you don't touch the mountain. You skip through a few verses. On the morning of the third day, this is around the Mount Sinai, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled, like they're scared. I mean, imagine you're camped around this mountain and a trumpet sound that is very loud comes from nowhere. Like, there's nobody sitting around with the trumpet. Like, you don't have your brass band over here set up for the event. Like, you don't know where it came from. Can you imagine how frightening, how terrifying? Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai, I wish I had a picture of it, but we don't, was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in the beautiful voice of God. Right? No, in thunder. A couple other reflections or a couple other descriptions of it. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. I would say so, right? And they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. You ever seen that part of this story before? Where the voice of God is so overwhelming that people are like, no more. We do not want to hear the voice of God. Moses, you just tell us what he said, because we can't handle this. Later in Deuteronomy, there's some reflections about what happened here. And he said, you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven. Wow. Wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. One more example. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. So those are all Old Testament descriptions of what happened at Mount Sinai. Sounds pretty terrifying, doesn't it? Now watch what happens over here in Hebrews. So we're in Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to pick up in verse 18 in this comparison of Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Verse 18, for you have not come to what may be touched. All right, so we should stop there and say, this is something, Mount Sinai at least, is a thing that can be touched. Now, notice that he says, you have not come. He's saying to these folks, listen, here's where you're at right now. You are not at Mount Sinai. Now, he never says Mount Sinai, but you'll see in a minute why this is Mount Sinai. He says, you're not at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai could feasibly be touched. Now, it's ironic that he says that, because what happens if you touch Mount Sinai? Yeah, it's game over, right? So you could touch it. Now, what we're going to see is there's a difference in Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Mount Sinai is all about the physical. Mount Zion is all about the spiritual. So here's how he describes Mount Sinai. You've not come to what could be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest, or great wind or great sound of a wind. And, verse 19, the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. In other words, we don't want to hear the voice of God anymore. This is too terrifying. Verse 20, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. It was, verse 21, indeed it was so terrifying that the sight that Moses was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. And this is Moses, right? This is God's chosen lawgiver in essence, and he's terrified by the scene. Now, as you look at this description of Mount Sinai, we could walk through each one of these descriptions and really hash it out, but I just want you to see the big picture. This is meant to be a scene that is absolutely terrifying, right? This isn't like Haunted Trail. Youth group went to the Haunted Trail a month or so ago, and I went with them, which you may find to be funny, and I went through the Haunted Trail with about 5 or 6 junior high girls, right? And to be honest, they were screaming like crazy. They were so scared, and I just laughed the whole time. I would say this, had I had to go through that alone, I would have been scared out of my mind. But instead, I just got to laugh at the junior high girls, which was kind of fun. But at the end, we were all kind of laughing, right? It was funny. There was some screaming along the way, but we were laughing through the whole thing. Whatever, if you've ever been on a haunted trail, haunted house, that's nothing compared to this. I want you to think about your greatest phobia, your greatest fear. There's all kinds of different fears. Maybe yours is represented up here somewhere. But that thing that absolutely terrifies you. Imagine just being surrounded by whatever that thing is. And again, there's several of them. Maybe it's going to the dentist, whatever. The picture here in Hebrews chapter 12, which is reflective, descriptive of what the Old Testament describes around Mount Sinai, is nothing compared to whatever your greatest fears are. They are in the presence of God, and it's not, oh, how nice. They're in the presence of God, and they are absolutely terrified. So get the picture here. Those who came to Mount Sinai get a scene that's absolutely terrifying. And Hebrews says that's not what you've arrived at. So let's keep reading. He says in verse 22, but you have come to Mount Zion. So you've not come here. You've come to Mount Zion. What's the description of Mount Zion? And to the city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering. That's a kind of a fancy way of saying you've come to a group of angels, innumerable angels, having a big old party. This is a festive environment. This is beautiful and festive. And verse 23, to the assembly of the firstborn. That word assembly is also the word from which we get church, and it just means assembly. And so the gathering, if you will, the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. So all of those whose names are written in the book of life, God's people. And to God, the judge of all. And to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Now, whether this is talking about people still alive or those who've gone on before, we're not exactly sure, but it's this image of God's people who've been redeemed and made perfect. And verse 24, you've come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. I'm glad Hayden talked about the covenant in the Lord's Supper. You've come to the mediator, you've come to Jesus. And to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel or any other sacrifice that might be offered. Now, we could hash every detail out and probably bore you to death, right? But what I want you to see is the picture that's being painted here. The purpose is not for us to see every little detail, but to see the overall picture. And what's the overall picture? The overall picture is, wow, look at what you had in Judaism. Look at the fear that you lived under. Look at the relationship you had with God that was one of fear. And now look what you have through Jesus Christ. And his point is, there's just no comparison. One side is grim and terrifying. And when you come to Jesus, where you're at now is beauty and grace and sacrifice and relationship, sacrifice through Jesus. And his point is to say, as you bring these two sides together, there's just no comparison. That's what as we read these verses, we ought to walk away from this saying, okay, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, there's no comparison. I don't know how many of you have been to the Memphis airport in the past 2.5 years. Some of you will remember, if you haven't been in the past 2.5 years, you'll remember the Memphis airport something like this. It's like you walk straight into the 1960s, right? And the ceilings are low and the lights are weird and all of the brick is straight from the 1960s and 70s, kind of like half the buildings at Freed-Hardeman, right? It's just not like I remember walking through here and thinking, ugh, and it stinks, like the carpet's old. And so I got to a point where if I had to fly somewhere, I'm like, I'm not flying out of Memphis, I'll drive to Nashville. Even though the airport's on the other side of the city, you got to go through the traffic, and it's longer, and it's more difficult, and it's more crowded. But a couple of years ago, I was with a group, and we had to fly through Memphis, and I hadn't been there, and I didn't know, and I was like, Memphis. And I got there, and now it looks like this. If you haven't been to the Memphis airport since it looked like that, it's drastically different. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it's if you have to wait in an airport, and so you know what? You know where I travel from now? If I got to fly, I'm not driving across Nashville in that mess of traffic. I'm going to Memphis. And I shouldn't say this because as soon as you try it, then the lines are shorter. I mean, everything about Memphis. And here's what I know. Old Memphis Airport, this got renovated a couple and a half years ago, and they're not done. Today, there's just no comparison. I mean, if you got to go to an airport, man, I love flying out of Memphis now. It's just so different. There's no comparison. And you could probably think of something in your life, an old way of doing things or an old place and the way they've changed it, and there's no comparison. And the point of this passage is for us to see the physical and terrible realities of Mount Sinai when you bring it to the spiritual realities of what we have in Jesus, the new covenant, the faith, all encompassing, that's described in verses 22 and following. There's just no comparison between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. There's just no comparison. You say, okay, Matt, fine. I'm also not a Jewish person who's tempted to formerly practice Jewish religion. I'm not tempted to go back to Jewish religion. So what do you do with this? Well, I think first of all, we have to acknowledge in context, what's the purpose? There's no comparison between the way of Jesus and Judaism. That's what he's trying to get across. But I think we need a reminder sometimes that there's no comparison between the way of Jesus and the ways of this world. And so maybe if Hebrews was written to us today, there wouldn't be a conversation about Judaism. Maybe the conversation would be comparing the ways of Jesus and the ways that we function and think in our world. And you know what our world's about. It's all about power. And it's all about political conversations and who's in power, and people put their trust and their hope in political systems. And can I remind you today that regardless of what you think about what's happened over the past couple of weeks, if you find your hope and peace in a political system, you will eventually be disappointed. And you'll be disappointed in serious ways, regardless of which side. You're going to end up disappointed. Because true hope and true peace can only be found in the way of Jesus. If you start looking for it in the ways of the world, you're going to end up severely disappointed, and you're going to end up in a lot of situations where you are not hope or peace filled. The way of Jesus is so much greater. There's no comparison. But there's also just no comparison between the way of Jesus and the darkness of a life controlled by sin. And I don't know if you're in a situation right now where maybe you feel kind of controlled by the darkness of sin, or maybe you don't realize it, but you are. I want to remind you that, as we said Wednesday night, that only Jesus can set you free. And if you've not been set free from a life controlled by sin, there's no better way to live. There's just no comparison. We want to help you with that. The Lord obviously wants you to come to Him, and He wants to set you free and make your burden easy. He wants to take that burden from you. But there's also just no comparison between the way of Jesus and a fear-based relationship with God, which I think is some of what's described in this context. The Jews lived, in a sense, in a fear-based relationship with God, and they never could be fully, they offered the sacrifices, but it was never enough. The sacrifices just had to keep being sacrificed. And I've heard many of us say here at Stantonville that perhaps in the past we lived this way. We lived in a fear-based relationship with God, and we thought, okay, as long as I check enough boxes and do enough good things and do this and this, and if I get it just right, then maybe I'll be saved. And maybe, just maybe, if I get it 100% right, then I won't be lost. But if I happen to just get one thing wrong, or then I'm lost. Listen, that's a really sad way to live. And it's a hard way to live, and it's not the way of Jesus, and it's not the way of the New Testament. We're under, as you read in this passage, a system of grace. In fact, do you remember what John says in 1 John 5, verse 13? I write these things to you that you may sort of be okay with your relationship. No, he says, I write these things so that you may know that you have eternal life. If you're in a box-checking, fear-based relationship with God, you will never know that you have a relationship with God. Now, let's be clear. Is God to be respected and feared, and is he awesome beyond our descriptions? Yeah. In fact, next week, you get to the end of this chapter, verse 29, for our God is a consuming fire. No doubt, this is a God who is all-powerful. But for those who are in relationship with him through Jesus Christ, he's not a God that we should be terrified of. He's not a God that we can work our way into salvation to. He's a God who loves us and by his grace has given us relationship with him through Jesus Christ. If you're living a fear-based relationship with God, I would encourage you to rethink the way you think about your relationship with God. Now, I want to be clear, this isn't just about us. It's easy to read this and think, yeah, we shouldn't live this way. But this is also about why we do missions. Because there are people across the globe who are living in absolute fear of a God or the gods because they do not know the Jesus who gives peace and hope and release from that fear. I think about my Hindu friends and your Hindu neighbors who maybe are in this system of rebirth. And do you know some of your Hindu friends believe that it's going to take hundreds, maybe even thousands of lifetimes of rebirth after rebirth after rebirth to maybe get to a point where they could be in a situation where they could go back into kind of this existence with God that's sort of a nothingness. It's hard to explain. Can you imagine how fearfully you must live every day? How fearful death must be? When you don't know, when you literally do not know what you're going to come back as after you die. Boy, there's some folks who really need the good news of Jesus. Or I think about my Buddhist friends. And again, we have our friends who practice these religions even in our own communities, who think maybe, again, if I can be reborn and reborn and reborn finally to a stage where maybe I can dedicate my life to just sitting around and meditating, then maybe I can enter nirvana, which just means extinguished, non-existence. Can you imagine the fear of living lifetime after lifetime after lifetime just to get to a point that maybe you're fortunate enough to go into non-existence? Or I think about our Muslim friends who every time they pray have to go through this intense and detailed series of washings because they are unclean before Allah. And though they do these washings in the morning, they'll do it again later in the day, and then again later in the day, and again later in the day, and then again the next day. You know why? Because they never feel as if they're clean before God. It's a tough way to live, isn't it? But what did we just read in Hebrews chapter 12? At Mount Zion, we come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Every time you pray, if you're a follower of Jesus, you come before God completely clean. There's a lot of people in our world that live in fear every day because of the way that they approach their God. Can I remind you, the reason we do mission is to invite people to a better way, to know Jesus Christ, and to not live a fear-based relationship with God. So when we invite people to this way, like if this is about mission and we're inviting people ultimately to the way of Jesus and not a way of darkness, what are we inviting people to? I think this text indicates, right? I think we're inviting people to a festive faith that's defined by grace. Look at it again, Verse 23, you're invited, or we've come to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Why are you enrolled in heaven? Because of how good you are? No, because of grace. And to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. And then verse 24. And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood. Why do we have the blood of Jesus? Because of how good? No, it's a place of grace. We're inviting people to a festive faith that's defined by grace and that's defined by joy. I love the description of the angels here. and to innumerable angels in festal gathering. We invite people to relationship with Jesus. When we come to faith in Jesus, we've come to a relationship with Jesus, a faith that is defined by joy. We're also coming to a faith that's defined by relationship. I love this language. Again, verse 22 or 23, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. This is not just about me and my personal relationship with Jesus. I'm invited into relationship with lots of other people, which means if you've got burdens, bring them on. Bring them on. That's what we're here for. This is relationship. But I think I go backwards in this text a little bit, and I'm reminded that while this is a festive faith, this is a holy, righteous God, and he calls us to holiness. You go back to verse 14 of Hebrews chapter 12. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. Part of what defines followers of Jesus is that we will be distinct and different from the world. Now, I probably don't talk about that enough. We probably don't talk about it enough in our churches in general. Like, we are called to live different and look different and spend our money different and act different. We ought to be distinct. We ought not be looking like the world. There's probably some lessons that we can learn from other religious groups that heavily emphasize holiness. And maybe they make it about works too much, but we need to be reminded that we are called to holiness, which means in some sense, when we live in this world, we're going to look different from the world. And sometimes I need that reminder, but this is also a relationship, a festive faith of gratitude. We'll get to it next week, but look at verse 28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom like this. So here's my question. As you look at this scene that says, okay, if this is a festive faith, and as we read this passage, this comparison, this is a faith that ought to be defined by grace, joy, relationship, holiness, and gratitude. That's a lot. We can spend a lot of time on each one of those words, but I would just ask you to do a little bit of self-evaluation and ask yourself, is my life defined by those 5 words? It'll never be perfect. Right? None of us will be defined by these perfectly, but we at least ought to be striving to look like this. Is your life defined by grace, joy, relationship, holiness, and gratitude? Let me expand that a little bit. Is your home? I know home looks different for a lot of people in here. For some, it's a house and there's multiple people in that house. For some, maybe it's just you. For some, it's a dorm, right? And your home is with a bunch of other people and it's kind of chaotic. I would just say, in your space, your home, is it defined by these 5 words? Again, none of us will get this perfect. But if we are inviting people and ought to be representing a faith that is a festive faith defined by these 5 words, I want the places and the spaces that I inhabit to look like this and be defined by this. And if it's not, then maybe it's just time to start refocusing. This is not a death sentence. Well, this isn't our home, so I guess this is stop and say, okay, how can we make our home, our dorm hall, wherever it is that we live and the places we inhabit, how can we make it a place defined by these 5 words? To the best of our ability, at least. I know that you're not in control of every situation that you might be in. But at least if I'm there, if you're there, we can do our best to make it a place defined by these things. And then last, I think these 5 words ought to define who we are as a church. And while I love this church and there's a lot of great things going on, there's probably some work to be done. Because all of us kind of bring our baggage to the table together, because we're a community in relationship. We bring some tough stuff, and so sometimes we need to be reminded, we need the wake-up call that this gathering of God's people ought to be a place defined by these 5 words. So I don't know where this lands for you. I just know as I read this passage, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion, there's just no comparison. I think about my own life, and I think about what I have in Jesus. There's just no comparison with what I have with Jesus compared to everything else and all the other stuff that might bombard my life that Satan throws at me. There's just no comparison. Is it too early for a Christmas movie illustration? Nope is the answer. I don't care what you think. So, the Grinch, right? Do you remember where the Grinch lives? He lives on, bonus points if you know the name of it, Mount what? Crumpit, yeah, right? He lives on Mount Crumpit, and it's not a very pleasant place, right? It stinks, and there's garbage, and his attitude is terrible, and his heart is really small. And so he goes into Whoville, right? And he steals everything related to Christmas. If he's miserable, they're gonna be miserable too. Except he gets up the next morning after ruining their Christmas and sucking all the joy out of their lives, at least from his perspective. And when he wakes up and he looks down and he's hoping to see their misery from his miserable mountain, what does he discover in Whoville? He hears something. And I think the book says something like this. He says he hears something merry, something very merry. Because even though he tried to suck the joy out of what they had with his misery, he couldn't do it. He couldn't steal their joy, no matter what he did to them. Now, Whoville is not on a mountain, right? So the illustration doesn't work perfectly. But it's a reminder to me as I think about my relationship with God and the way Satan attacks us and all the ways that our world might want to suck the joy out of our lives. And Satan wants us to be as miserable as everyone else because of Jesus Christ and what we have in him. If we're seeking his face, no one can steal that joy from us. It may attack us. We may lose everything. Life may be really difficult, but you can't steal our hope and our joy and our peace, because as long as we're seeking the face of Jesus, you can't take Jesus away from us. And there's no comparison with what I have in Jesus compared to anything else that I might find in this world. If we can help you to find Jesus today, we'd love to do so while we stand and sing together.
Every time I kneel to pray, I open up my heart.